The general idea I had starting Plural was, okay, I know I can deploy applications really, really repeatably with like this interesting dependency-based mechanism that we have with Plural, and it would be a pretty cool experience. But like, how do you bootstrap a business around it? And the core problem, like if you're creating a marketplace, is like you've got to have some degree of demand in the system for it to ever go from zero.
You are listening to the Kubelist Podcast, a show interviewing project maintainers for Cncf Sandbox, incubating and graduated projects. We'll discuss each project to understand where it came from and discuss the roadmap and plans to continue the project. Hi, I'm Mark Campbell. Together with Benjie de Groot, we publish the Kubelist weekly newsletter dedicated to Kubernetes and the Cncf ecosystem. I'm the founder and CTO at Replicated, where we enable cloud-native software vendors like HashiCorp, Puppet, Sneak, Harness, and many others to operationalize and scale the distribution of their modern on-prem software. Check us out at replicated.com. Benjie is the co-founder and CEO at Shipyard, where they enable software teams of all sizes to build, test, and deploy faster and more reliably via their ephemeral environment management platform. Get started with ephemeral environments at shipyard.build. The Kubelist Podcast is brought to you by Heavybit, a program dedicated to helping startups take their developer products to market. For more information, visit heavybit.com. Finally, sign up for the Kubelist weekly newsletter and read previous issues at kubelist.com. On this episode of the Kubelist Podcast, Benjie and I were joined by Michael Guarino from Plural to talk about his open source platform that helps manage and install open source software in production in Kubernetes. We started out just talking about Michael's background working on some small teams running large infrastructure, including Twitter and Facebook. Michael shares his experiences, and it's clear that these experiences have caused him to think that we can all manage infrastructure better than we are today. Anyway, Michael goes on to explain the Plural product, what it does, and how they build and maintain it today. There's a lot of really cool stuff here, and hopefully listening to this and looking at the Plural product can help you streamline how you're running production-grade open source software. Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Kubelist Podcast. On today's episode, we have Michael Guarino from Plural to talk about his project and how it aims to make it easier to deploy and operate open source applications, hopefully in Kubernetes. We're going to learn all about the project. But before we start, as always, Benjie's here with me.
Hello, hello, hello.
All right. So let's start off with some quick introductions and backgrounds. Michael, why don't you just start us off with telling us what you did before creating Plural?
Yeah. So I've been basically an engineer the entirety of my career. Right out of college, I joined Amazon in Seattle for a couple of years. I was on one of the resale website teams, just doing boring Amazon stuff, I guess. But really, I wanted to go to live in New York, and I did that by joining actually the Vine team at Twitter. So I was one of the backend engineers at Vine, which is a pretty cool experience. We actually only had 5 backend engineers at peak running all of Vine's platform. And we were running basically all of the open source infrastructure at scale, like our own MySQL, all our own Redis, Memcached, RabbitMQ, actually a pretty big Elasticsearch cluster as well. So I got a lot of hands-on experience of running infrastructure really, really directly at scale there, which was really, really fun. And then, Vine was discontinued in 2016, as everyone knows. Had to find a new place. I did not want to work at Twitter any longer. And I ended up leaving backend engineering at Frame.io, where I built most of their core systems as well. So it basically ended up building so much that I had nothing really interesting left to build, and went to Facebook and was quickly disillusioned by what I was doing at Facebook. It was just frankly very boring to me. And I was extremely, extremely bulled up about Kubernetes at the time. And what I was seeing was the emergence of standardization of what a distributed system really should be or defined as. And that really wasn't the case. And it was what caused, I think, a lot of the problems around the manageability of a lot of infrastructure, because every single company would have their own, special Snowflake setup. They'd just do it their own way. They'd have their own bash scripts, everything like that. And it just it was just a constant mess, really. And if you have some degree of industry-wide standard, you can suddenly automate on top of that and make what was now Plural the ability to repeatedly deploy pretty complicated stacks in a lot of different infrastructures a viable possibility. And so that's what I wanted to do.
Yeah, so that makes sense. So yeah, the Snowflake style deployment definitely, makes it difficult to manage. But I want to go back. So you said at Twitter, when you were working on Vine, there were 5 infrastructure engineers managing all of that infrastructure at scale. Did I hear that right? 5?
Yeah, that's basically correct. Yeah, and really we had basically 2 SREs and 3 people who were doing more actually building the APIs and everything like that. But that was really it. And it was like 50 million monthly active users. And it was like a pretty, like at the time, I was completely blown away. I came from Amazon very much with the opinion that, frankly, Amazon should just run everything. It's too hard for mere mortals to do. And seeing that it actually happened at Vine was like just a complete paradigm shift for me, because we were running very complicated infrastructure, like a sharded MySQL with multi-master, with master replica failover for every single shard, with like our own cloning procedures and everything, and it was actually doable. And so I had to figure out what that gap was, and it was pretty clear, actually, like once I sort of teased it all out, that the gap was operational knowledge. It's just like what's making people build infrastructure this way is a staffing problem. They just can't find people who have deep infrastructure experience. And the reason you need that deep infrastructure experience is because you have to just know so much in the stack. You have to know Linux fundamentals, then you have to know like the various APIs you're actually interacting with, Kubernetes or the cloud provider APIs. And you'll have to know distributed systems fundamentals to do debugging and stuff like that. It's pretty rare to find a single human being who can know that. But again, if you have some degree of standard API that you're programming against, you can have software know all that for you instead of a person, and that completely changes the game, hopefully.
Yeah, so I imagine at Twitter, in order to do that, or at Vine, sorry, in order to do that, you really did have to, like, there was not a single snowflake in there. Everything had to conform, because like it's a slippery slope once you start doing anything, off, like that doesn't just follow a normal pattern.
I wouldn't go that far.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's the idealized version of that, I think. Yeah. Wait, so at Vine, were you guys on Kubernetes? This is 2016, I think you said. Is that right?
Yeah, so this was really like right at the beginning of a lot of the containerization stuff, and Kubernetes was quite immature, so we were not on Kubernetes, and that's why.
Right, but Twitter was Mesos at the time, I believe.
Yeah, and we were not in Twitter's main infrastructure. That's another interesting detail. So we were actually on AWS, whereas Twitter has its own data centers, and most of the acquisitions had a similar issue. Like Periscope was the same deal, and they would have to figure out how to interact with core Twitter systems, but. Like we actually ran everything basically on EC2 machines and like manually operated all of those systems. So that was even more bonkers. Like we didn't have a proper orchestration system, and we were still able to like basically manage the operations for the entire platform with a very small team. And it was because like we had like tons of ex-Google SREs, ex-Amazon, we had like an extremely cracked team, even by Twitter standards, running the thing.
Right, but the big takeaway is if you don't have a bunch of Google SREs sitting in your back pocket, it's pretty difficult to do.
Oh yeah, it would not happen for sure. Yeah, unless like software fills the gap.
Right, of course. And were you containerized at the time, or was it not even containers?
When I first started, it was not containerized at all, and then we tried to start moving to Mesos and Marathon. That's what fitting along with the same like scheduling system that Twitter was using, but. Like it was maybe like 60 to 70% done, and then Vine was discontinued.
Right. So you were really pushing a pretty big boulder up a pretty steep hill. With all of that experience.
Yeah.
All right. So we have to ask, how many fail whales did you deal with?
I was not early enough in Vine that the infrastructure was immature. The biggest thing that happened there was. I don't think you guys remember, but there was that terror attack in Paris in like 2015 when ISIS was really active. And there was a video of like either AK-47s or a bomb going off at a soccer game or like outside of a soccer game. And it was like the most viewed video on Vine at all, and like in all time. Vine was killed sort of after it. So like nothing was able to compete for it. But it actually blew up like an entire database shard. It was getting that much traffic. So I think that was the biggest outage I remember, mostly because obviously it was also like a pretty historic event, but the consequence of it being like it made us also have to, have a pretty interesting on-call rotation.
I mean, just for a second here, I think it's worth acknowledging, like, the cameras in our pockets, the phones, all that stuff has gotten us to a place where pretty significant news, pretty significant things like that can get distributed immediately. And a good part of what we're doing here is that we're helping to build out infrastructure that actually educates people and gives people some stuff. So there's obviously some downsides to that, as we've seen.
Yeah.
But there's also some really powerful positives there. So moving on. So then you went to Facebook, and what were you using at Facebook? Was that Kubernetes? What was that?
Yeah, this is somewhat like public, but not everyone knows. Facebook basically built their own. They've been around long enough. They're like sort of like Google, where they built their own orchestration and containerization system. So they have a system called Tupperware, which is like their analog to Borg at Google. And I don't know to what extent they poach people from Google to build it, but that's what they use for orchestration entirely. I think there's some Kubernetes usage, but it's probably more on like the enterprise engineering side. So like back office applications, like the actual production systems all run on Tupperware. And I don't fully know what they use for actually containerizing applications. I don't remember. It ultimately resolves down to Linux C groups like the Docker container does, but it's not Docker. It's something completely different. And they have their own like package system as well that like basically you can't roll all of Facebook's servers with like a standard like Docker registry. It would actually blow up network switches. So they have to use something that's equivalent to like the BitTorrent API to distribute their packages.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. So while you were at Facebook, though, you were kind of, it doesn't really matter, I guess. Like, I know that, like, this is the Kubelist podcast. We talk about Kubernetes, but like, it's really these like primitives and these common API abstractions around container orchestration and scheduling and running and operating that makes it like, that's the value, right? So Tupperware being an implementation of it, you still start to like say, oh, wow, like I can avoid these bespoke solutions, avoid Snowflake systems and get scale.
Oh yeah, for sure. And there's like some aspects of Tupperware that are like heads and shoulders better than Kubernetes. So one thing it does is it can deploy in multiple regions without any real sweat. So whereas Kubernetes really is completely locked down to a single region, and it does like much larger scale deployments than a standard Kubernetes cluster would be able to manage as well. Like deployments with like hundreds of thousands of servers underneath them. Whereas I think a Kubernetes controller would probably start choking for that sort of thing, just based on the way it's architected. But there are also like huge issues with Tupperware in terms of its usability and everything like that, people like who had a Kubernetes background were like, oh, I wish I was still using Kubernetes. So.
I mean, in fairness, like I've never worked at Google, but like I've heard similar stories about Borg, where like Borg had scale, but usability challenges, which is why they rewrote it in, like Borg, Omega, Kubernetes, and here we are.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's like inevitable, and it's part of that's also just like the open source development lifecycle versus like an internal development, where you can sort of force like weird primitives down your company's throat, but an open source community would sort of revolt at that, and it kind of disciplines you into creating something that's a little bit of a better product.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that like I'm excited to dive into here and talk about Plural is, these container orchestration. Let's talk about Kubernetes. Like these platforms provide lots of different values. One of them is scale and bin packing and cost reduction. But like one that I think is the super powerful to even smaller organizations is just that common API, like the standardization that says this is how all software can actually interact with the infrastructure. And so, like, I'd love to hear, like, give us the pitch of what is Plural? What does Plural do?
Yeah, so think of Plural as kind of like a package manager for applications to deploy to Kubernetes. So what we want to give is a experience kind of comparable to, like the NPM add when you add a JavaScript library to like one of your applications, but for a full stack into your Kubernetes cluster. You could just do Plural bundle install, like Airbyte and GCP. It'll give you a wizard of the initial configuration for it. Then you'll do Plural build. It'll sync all the artifacts locally into your Git repository so you can track the state of the application appropriately and have complete ownership of it. And then Plural deploy will then take all those artifacts, the Helm charts and Terraform modules and so on and so forth, and create the application in your cloud. But the like basically ultimate goal is you just get completely validated deployment packages that you can deploy wherever you want them.
You mentioned Helm charts, Terraform modules, and et cetera. So if I want to run some open source package, do I need Kubernetes, or can the Terraform actually like create the Kubernetes cluster for me also?
Yeah, that's a good question. It does actually create the Kubernetes cluster for you. So you don't even have to really think about Kubernetes at all to use Plural. It can be considered like an entire implementation detail. And we will create Kubernetes in like the most low operational like effort way. So we'll use the managed control planes for the major clouds, like AKS for Azure, EKS for AWS and so on and so forth. We also have a pretty featureful admin console. So you deploy your applications, you can also deploy our console application, and it'll give you a full administrative suite with all the operational tools you need to understand how to manage the application. So it has things like dashboards and logs. It'll receive upgrades over the air. So when we push new versions of a package, it'll actually automatically deploy it for you. You don't even have to think about upgrades. And then we also have a pretty cool interactive runbook experience. So more complicated things like scaling a database where you probably don't know the underlying Kubernetes CRD that's representing that database. You can just have a purely graphical experience where you input that new amount of CPU or that new amount of memory to it, or maybe add a few gigabytes to its underlying disk, and it then click scale and it'll do it all for you. And that system is also extremely flexible, so we can create all sorts of different wizards to do other complicated interactive operational tasks with a fully graphical experience. So you don't have to learn kubectl or anything complicated like that.
So kind of going back, right? So running a database, especially a database in at scale, distributed, in Kubernetes, there's lots of challenges. So we as an industry, we're like operators. That's a great abstraction around that. I don't need to understand how to operate that database. There's all these config and everything like this. Yep. I can have this reconcile loop that's watching it and maintaining the desired state. And what you're doing is providing an even easier to use abstraction on top of that. Does it have to be an operator, or can it literally just be anything that's driving through a graphical interface?
Yeah, it can literally be anything. So some of the InfluxDB doesn't have an operator, but we have a runbook for scaling the InfluxDB deployment that we have. That's ultimately just resolves down to reconfiguring a help chart. So it's meant to be a very flexible system, and it's just a matter of us, adding the appropriate plugins to be able to solve for any of those operational issues. But the operators are really simple, but there's a ton of people who are not going to want to learn the spec of an operator and how to interact with them. And if you can just give them a graphical interface that they can interact with instead, it's a huge win for them, and they'll be able to do things they wouldn't have done otherwise.
So this kind of harkens back to your whole software abstraction layer for infrastructure.
Yeah,
and so really, it's a pretty powerful abstraction on top of Kubernetes. And so this is for open source projects, correct? This is like for Elastic or MySQL or whatever. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, there's no technical limitation that would mean that we have to always do open source projects, but it's what we're going to be focused on primarily because there's a ton of people who obviously want to deploy them. They have a ton of adoption already, so we can plug right in and get a lot of users that way. So there's a little bit of a scaling concern there, and it also makes it just a lot easier from a licensing perspective and stuff like that as well. So there's a lot of advantages to it. We hopefully will emerge, we'll develop to a point where people can deploy their own applications with Plural as well. We have a pretty good deployment engine. Our console hopefully is a really good experience for managing any application, not just open source ones. And hopefully people will really like it and want to use it more. So
you're talking in that scenario is first party application deployment. I have an API that I'm running in Kubernetes, but I should be able to have this this nice operationalized in graphical way to be able to manage it if I want it.
Yeah, exactly.
Got it.
Yeah. One of the big benefits there is operational handoff. So when you're ramping up a new DevOps engineer or a new backend engineer, if you have that full suite of operational tools that they can just jump right into, then it's a really big deal. And then obviously time to response for incidents. The gold standard at Facebook for their foundation teams is they would build web interfaces for all their common incidents and do all of their operations via those web UIs because your response time is just that much faster. And if you know what's going to go wrong, you should be able to automate it to that degree. So same sort of principle.
I'm curious why that is. Why is a web interface that much faster to be able to respond versus somebody who is able to access the cluster and run kubectl or whatever the Tupperware equivalent of that would be?
I think it's just because if you think of what you do when you're responding to an incident, it's a lot of data aggregation you're basically doing, right? So you have to view a ton of metrics to understand what actually is going wrong. Then you have to context switch into a totally different interface and figure out log in or whatever credentials you have to get access to get kubectl access. It just makes it a lot slower. And then a confirmation that you've actually fixed it as well, it would be another context switch into another interface. But if you have just everything in an interactive dashboard or something like that, you can basically do everything in one place and understand exactly what's going on and fix it.
Yeah, I really tend to agree with you, Michael. Marc, I've worked with Marc before. He's an amazing engineer. He doesn't understand why some of us aren't as fluent at the CLI as he is. Let's just put it that way. But Marc, not everyone eats, breathes, and sleeps kubectl. Okay, so just get over it. Okay,
it's useful even if you are like a bash god, right? All the Facebook SREs who are top tier, they're very good with the command line. But the truth is, if you basically have like an existing runbook that you would be executing anyways, that it could easily become a web interface, and you don't have to go through a doc, then go through another UI to figure out your metrics, and then go through another UI to figure out how to log into something, and then go to a terminal, and then go back and back and back. So it becomes a much easier, smoother experience.
Yeah, no, that's great. Like thinking about it in terms of avoiding the context switching, you end up with this reproducible process that everybody's going through. It's definitely easier to onboard, and you're not avoiding the CLI. You're just saying there's a normal way that we can go through this. Like I'm guessing if I have a Airflow deployed through Plural, I still have kubectl access to that cluster if I need to do some kind of advanced operation. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's go back, and you mentioned one kind of word you mentioned was when I think was the word that you said it, when we push new versions of these packages, they're easy to get and install and update. So is that what Plural does? Is you're actually taking these open source packages and creating the package published version that you're recommending that we run?
Yeah. So, and ultimately this is something we want to also build a community of people doing. But at the moment, we're the primary packager. And for the most part, if taking Airflow as an example, because it's definitely a good anchoring example for this. But what we'll do is we'll find the best Helm chart out in the open source ecosystem, and then hydrate it with the appropriate stuff to create that operational environment, the dashboards, the log filters, the runbooks and everything like that. Make sure that it's deployed in a production ready way. So we'll figure out how to get IRSA identity for EKS appropriately, or workload identity for GKE. So you have temporary credentials getting injected into the cluster, set up the S3 logging, everything else that you would need for a full cloud deployment, and then also figure out the persistence layer appropriately. So Airflow has a Postgres database underneath it, so we'll use an appropriate way of deploying a Postgres database. We typically use the Zalando Postgres operator for that, but it will at least be something with things like backup and restore, failover, and all that you would want, instead of a really kind of crappy Bitnami Helm chart deployment of Postgres, which is what you normally see wrapped up in these charts.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. Is what are you adding on top of what Bitnami has? But it sounds like you're really just instead of here's a million different options on how you could deploy it, which is really great. And it's awesome that Bitnami has these public Helm charts available, but you're actually saying, look, we've put a lot of effort into thinking through what's a sane way to run this in production, so you don't have to understand what all these different options are.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So what our goal is to make sure that all of the things that we packaged are production ready, like production grade deployments. And then the other big thing is if you do install a Bitnami chart, you're going to have to read the charts values file and really dive in deeply into how it actually works just to install it. So our installation, our bundle install process, where you basically go through a pretty guided wizard, means you don't have to read any source code or anything like that to get up and running. Hopefully, it's just a very guided, simple experience, and then boom, you have an application. Then the other big thing with a Bitnami product is there's no operational environment after you've installed it. And that's, to me, the biggest problem, because while I might be willing to pay that initial upfront installation cost, if it comes with a recurring constant operational headache afterwards, then I'm not going to be confident about it whatsoever. And our admin console and all those operational tools that we've been talking about, I think actually makes it a viable product that beyond just the cool getting started user experience.
Right. So how do I handle my secrets and my environment variables and stuff like that when configuring this stuff?
This is a really important question. Basically, all GitOps has this issue, and there's a lot of different solutions for it. What we basically did is we re-implemented in our CLI the GitCrypt open source project, which it'll basically encrypt secrets directly into the Git index itself. So when you push a change to Git with a file that would have a secret, it'll be completely AES 256 encoded in GitHub or GitLab or wherever. But then when you check it out and clone it, and then you run Plural crypto in it, Plural crypto in Nock, it will decrypt it entirely for you. And we have ways of managing the symmetric keys and everything like that for people so that they can appropriately share their repos and stuff like that. But that's how we manage our secrets. It makes it a lot easier to do a lot of the automation in terms of generating all those repositories. And it's just like a wildly better user experience than all the other secret management tools I've seen for GitOps.
And then, so like at the end, it is running as potentially a secret in Kubernetes. So the chart, if you had an upstream chart table, like you don't have to repackage all that to have a different runtime or anything like that.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm curious, how big is the team at Plural right now?
So we're definitely growing. If you caught me like a couple of weeks ago, it would be very different. But we have now 6 full-time employees and then 3 other people who are on as contractors, but basically with us full-time. And then we're going to have 4 more employees coming in by July.
That's great. So how, like, that's a pretty small team. You're trying to build a product and you're trying to maintain the packaging for these open source projects. So how do you scale that, right? Like how many folks and how much work does it take to maintain that Airflow package as an example and keep updates available and like understand all the changes that are in it and make them available to anybody who's running Plural?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is there's definitely going to be a point at which like this can't scale to a single organization. So a big part of what we're doing is we're building this as an open source project with the idea that hopefully we can create a community around it of people who will do some of that work around packaging and maintaining of specific applications, or the communities themselves. The Airflow community would be eager to do the packaging for Airflow on Plural. So we can sort of divide and conquer that workload. There are some interesting details with it, though. So one of them is the way that Plural becomes as an architecture is it kind of simplifies things pretty radically. So we're never going to be deploying like some sort of multi-tenant Airflow that works for millions and millions of people. It's just an Airflow cluster for a single company. It's relatively simple, and it's still a distributed system, and there's a lot of complications around it, but it's definitely something you can kind of get your arms around. And the actual amount of work to upgrade a new version of Airflow, it ends up being about like a day's worth of work for each individual shot. It's basically, figuring out the new chart version, doing some tests on the various different infrastructures. Now, some scaling hacks that we have done. One is we've used Renovate. So Renovate's a pretty cool tool to manage dependencies for a lot of different languages, but they have support for Helm and Terraform. So it'll actually give us new issues whenever there's like a new upstream chart change for all the charts that we use. So if there's a new version of the Airflow chart, we'll suddenly get an issue in our Plural artifacts repo to pay attention to it. Just that sort of like constant pull of the things that you're updating is something that obviously causes a lot of work, and we would have had to create a manual process around if we didn't have that automation. The other big thing that we've done is we've gone through the step of creating a full integration testing framework. So when we push new versions of these applications, that new bleeding edge version will deploy into all of our own clusters in AWS, GCP, and Azure, and we'll run a basic test on it. Like in this case, it's running like the aggregate health check on the application. If it goes to green, the test passes, and we'll promote that version to a different tag that actual users can respond to and actually get their upgrade off of. So we have a full testing suite to deploy these things at scale now as well, which is a big quality becomes the biggest deciding problem with managing this, and creating that automation to ensure quality is a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I would push back, or I would have a little concerns on just from real world experience is like, I've had plenty of charts that go green, but then I start using it at scale, and all of a sudden some weird esoteric setting that I had no idea existed is like all of a sudden a disaster, and it brings down production. Yeah. So, I mean, obviously the integration test stuff is a huge step on that. But like, I mean, how can I get comfortable if I'm, Bank of America and I'm using you guys for my Elasticsearch, but are you guys like, not that Bank of America uses Elasticsearch, but hypothetically, like, how are you guys, or do you guys have plans, I guess is really the question, to like do load testing around these packages, I guess is kind of my question.
Yeah, I think basically we've only scratched the surface of the integration testing problem. So like, there's just like a lot of ways that these things can fail, especially at scale. I doubt like, someone running some like mass throughput Elasticsearch cluster is going to like be truly validated by an Elasticsearch like integration test we do for the entire platform. One thing we would probably like consider doing is having them have their own promotion pipeline that they can test for their specific infrastructure use case instead of the main package pipeline that we're talking about, because it's frankly going to be their own configuration. Now, the majority of our users, like the vast majority of our users, basically just use it with like default settings. Use a lot of these applications with default settings, and they don't have like a really crazy setup. And so like it really does actually validate that that'll land correctly with them. But yeah, you're 100% right that there will be some edge cases that like people are going to have to figure out themselves, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that's kind of cool, though, what you guys are building out and how I could see, and maybe I'm going a little crazy here, but there could be like a community integration testing effort long term or something where it's like, oh, well, we tested out a canary version of this so we can help you validate. Stuff like that, just from a community perspective, it just kind of, it's an interesting thought. I haven't seen that yet, but I feel like, as we grow out all this stuff and how can big enterprise contribute to the open source community? One thing that's just tickled my brain right there is, maybe we can get them to, do a bit of integration testing.
That's actually a pretty cool point. Like you could have like that one enterprise with like a massive at scale deployment, run some tests there and like, have a different like release channel for the package if it validates that. That's pretty cool. Yeah. The framework is actually flexible enough to do that sort of thing. So like we could actually do that out of the box with what we currently have. The other kind of interesting thing is like, I don't think there's like really good solutions for this period on the market right now. Like no one really does. Like all the testing is locked into CI/CD. We need to do it this way because of just the nature of what we're doing. So like if we're going to truly validate our packages, it kind of needs to be running in infrastructure, because part of the validation is like, is IRSA working properly with it? And you can't really tell that unless you actually inspect the result of the underlying EKS, IRSA operator, and if it injects the service account tokens and all that goodness and works appropriately. So the long-term vision of it is we'll have like a full Python SDK that can like interact with Kubernetes API, just see if resources are looking the appropriate way, and do other like very common. It run like Selenium tests as well. Like that's one thing we really want to do for every single application that has a web interface, and do like a very basic or deep Selenium smoke test around like logins. The UI is actually interactive in the way that we'd expect, stuff like that.
You mean Playwright, right? Because that's the new hotness.
Whatever. Yeah, Cypress is.
And Cypress is great too. I love Cypress as well. I joke. Yeah. I think it's super interesting trying to deal with dependency management for other people, which is kind of at the core what Plural seems to be doing. What are my options for a canary deploy? So if I'm using Plural and I've got my Elastic cluster running, and then there's a new upgrade that I assume I opt into the upgrade. It's not just automatic, or is it what's the model there? Actually, that's a good question. Is it like etcd where it just automatically updates, or how does that work?
Yeah, you have a lot of different controls. So you can control the specific tag you track. So like we have like 3 ones that are just out of the box, latest, warm and stable. You can also control in your console on the application level, or there's actually kind of like a holistic policy mechanism for it. But what it'll do when the console receives an upgrade. So you can require approval, you can just apply it, or you can actually ignore the automatic upgrade entirely. We also want to do things like maintenance windows and all of those other, interesting little control features, but they're on the roadmap and haven't been implemented yet. As far as a canary deployment, what we probably recommend people doing at the moment is creating both a dev and prod cluster for the infrastructure they're creating with Plural, which is very easy to do. There's a ton of different ways to skin the cat. It's because we make it really easy for you to create clusters, right? But you can have your infrastructure running in a dev cluster, validate it, and then approve it. That's either by tracking a follower tag or by having an approval flow and your prod cluster to have it deploy there.
So I want to switch gears for a second. Like, how does Plural make money doing this?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we kind of have a dual strategy around monetization. The first way that we'll do it is we'll have feature differentiation in the product. We'll effectively have an enterprise tier of Plural. And the features that will go into an enterprise tier are very accepted enterprise type features. And one of them we actually recently implemented SSO. So Plural actually acts as an identity provider for all the applications that are deployed by Plural. You can opt into using our OIDC provider and use Plural to log into your Airflow or log into your Airbyte or log into your Grafana or anything else that you deploy. And you can add SSO to your Plural account now as well with directory sync. And that's going to be offered for people who decide to sign up with an enterprise plan. The other, we'll add other features that'll be very natural enterprise things, but they'll all be focused on managing applications at scale, like in a business context. We'll 100% keep a good, small scale tier free and open source as for the entirety of our existence. The other strategy is the vendor ecosystem that we hopefully will create around Plural also can create some monetization. So we hopefully will get other open source projects actually committing to using Plural as a distribution channel and offering their enterprise licenses on it, and we'll get a reseller cut as a result of that. So those are the two monetization strategies that we have at the moment. Maybe there'll be other ways to monetize it. Who knows? But really, to be honest, what we're most focused on right now is just getting people to use the product.
Sure.
So we're not really super concerned or pushy about revenue. We're much more interested in getting people to play around with it, giving us feedback, learning from our users on what we can do better and improving the product from there.
But in a perfect world, you're able to work with some of the best, most popular open source projects, get out of the packaging business because they see the value in it. They are actually creating the packages. They're able to use your SDKs to validate them and then push that as their preferred method for both the open source and the enterprise versions of that product?
100%. Yeah, that's the long-term goal.
And then you mentioned the SSO. Is that using Dex, Keycloak, something like that underneath the hood, or did you implement the OIDC provider yourself?
It uses Ori's Hydra project for the Oauth Handshake. And you got to think of it more of as a service provider. As Dex is like an identity provider. I guess it might be able to do both. It's been a long time since I've looked into the docs of it, but the applications themselves receive the OIDC login, so it's not that side of the handshake. And then for SSO itself, we use WorkOS, which is a SaaS product from some people who actually were at Stripe previously that does a really good job of making it really easy to onboard people to it's via SSO. It has really good step-by-step instructions on setting up SSO with Okta or with Active Directory or G Suite or any of the other solutions out there. But the big thing is it has directory sync, a really good implementation of directory sync that's actually usable instead of having to implement SCIM2, which is really terrible. So
yeah. I think we looked at implementing it one time, and at the time there was only 3 or 4 companies that have successfully implemented SCIM, and we're okay, you know what? There's other solutions here.
Yeah.
I think I was at Replicated when we were looking at that, and I remember the nightmareness of that.
Yeah, it's wildly easy now with WorkOS, so I would 100% plug them if anyone was in that pain at the moment.
Awesome, yeah. The next part, right? Part of day 2 operations. We've talked a lot about how easy it is to install. You have Terraform, you can create the Kubernetes cluster, and then in updates. But there's also support, right? Things might not be working right. I might have Airflow running and it fails. Do you get involved in there, or what do you? If I'm using, Plural to deploy Airflow and then something's not right, what do I do?
Yeah. So we have a couple of different ways. One, we have an active Discord channel that people actually do jump into and ask us for support over. We actually have intercom as well in our product for people who might need support with just our web interfaces in general. But people will ask questions through it as well. Long term, we're actually building a support interface in the product. It's not fully. I don't think it's fully ready for prime time at the moment, but the cool thing about that, and the reason why we're doing it, is we can create incidents proactively with it a lot easier than, it's not as easy to post a message in Discord or something like that. So it'll create incidents from Alert Manager, alarms at fire. It'll create incidents when a deployment fails, all sorts of different, very common failures or configurable failures. You can, as a part of packaging application, you can create your own alerts, for instance, an Alert Manager, and it'll pick them up. And so like that's also meant to help for those like, the support experience that you can't plan for as easily. And it has like a chat interface. It has the ability to create Zoom meetings in it and everything like that. So we'll be making that like a really good, hopefully a good experience for triaging issues and managing them.
Yeah, I mean, support can be a huge part of the enterprise contracts that you hopefully will be getting a bunch of. All right, so let's switch gears a little bit here. So Plural is an open source project, right? And we'll have a link to it at the GitHub in the show notes. But talk to us about like why you started there. Like what inspired you to do this as an open source thing? I think we've kind of covered this tangentially a little bit already, but I think it's also really interesting. If I'm a founder that is interested in a separate project, like, was it smart to start open source? What was your thinking behind it? How did you end up doing this open source thing? And then as a follow-up, I want to talk to you a little bit about Cncf stuff, but let's just start there.
Yeah, for sure. So there's a couple of interesting things that we had to think through when we were starting this. So like in general, like the general idea I had starting Plural was, okay, I know I can deploy applications really, really repeatably with like this interesting dependency-based mechanism that we have with Plural, and it would be a pretty cool experience. But like, how do you bootstrap a business around it? And the core problem, like if you're creating a marketplace, ultimately, that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to create an application marketplace. Is like you've got to have some degree of demand in the system for it to ever go from zero. And it became pretty apparent like from the start that, there's a ton of existing demand, just like with a whole bunch of people who have these crazy operational pains around their open source infrastructure footprint. And we don't have to, like do hard like B2B selling to get, other companies to get on board. We can just tap right into that problem and fix it. So that was a big deal. Once we sort of like settled that, okay, that's the set of applications that we want to play with, then it like being an open source project ourselves is like kind of an immediate corollary. We can't be deploying open source applications and ourselves be closed source. It's like a huge disconnect. The other thing from a business perspective is I think people like who still have qualms around the open source model, it's usually around not being able to control IP and all of that. I don't think the long-term value of Plural is really around its IP. It's more around its community and adoption of usage. If there's like a massive number of people onboarding on Plural, packaging applications on Plural, that's going to have critical mass and it's not going to be movable. Like they're not going to go to an alternative because you basically create a network effect. There's a new application, like a net new application, isn't going to want to go to a competitor if they can't depend on all the other things that their architecture needs, like the best Postgres operator, the best RabbitMQ operator, the best Redis deployment, and everything like that, and then have that full ecosystem around it, alongside not having all the demand already in the system and everything like that. So the trade-off of maybe not having, like a vice grip control over your IP versus having a really strong goodwill with the community of users that we hopefully would create and bootstrapping that as quickly as possible was like an obvious choice for us.
I mean, that makes a whole bunch of sense. What was a challenge? What was one of the challenges, early challenges on this being an open source project? Obviously, you guys are just getting started. We got to get you some stars. Everyone go to their GitHub and give them a star.
Yeah.
But besides star accumulation, what are some of the early challenges that maybe you didn't expect coming from a Facebook and a Twitter experience? I
mean, I actually do think the star accumulation thing is you can kind of like, push it this side, but it's actually quite hard. And a lot of the projects that do get really big, I think, frankly, it's kind of just a like unpredictable phenomenon that they actually work for, unless it's like there's a very common playbook where it works, where it's like open source for X, like NoCodeDB is open source for Airtable. That usually is a pretty consistent playbook, but for the other stuff, it's really quite a mixed bag and being able to create adoption. The other thing that's definitely different is the release process in open source. So you have to be a lot more like you got to do a lot more documentation and a lot more like outward engagement than when you're like deploying in any SaaS service, not necessarily a Facebook, where you just you churn and burn code constantly. I need to add a feature. Okay, I'm gonna program that feature. I'm going to push it to a branch, merge it into master, and it's going to go into production immediately. That's not how it works in open source. You have to kind of have like version releases with notes and everything like that. So that process is definitely a little bit different.
So let me ask you this question. When you are doing a release of Plural itself, just walk us through the mechanics there, like just from an open source perspective of doing a release. I mean, again, you guys are early, but it's interesting to understand what the requirements are there explicitly.
Yeah, so Plural is actually quite complicated in terms of the code base. So it's not just one thing that could theoretically be released. So there's app.plural.sh, which has its own repository, plural.sh plural. There's the admin console, which has its own repository, plural.sh console, and our command line interface could also be released at any given time, which has its own repository, plural.sh, plural CLI. The deployment of plural.sh plural is actually very comparable to any SaaS deployment, although it actually uses Plural to deploy itself. So, we'll create a PR. We have a test suite that runs. If everything looks good and we have an approval, we'll merge it and it'll deploy. It'll bake up Docker images and deploy itself out of that. The console is a little bit different because it is deployed to all of our users as well. So it's same basic process where we have a test suite that runs on PR, merges it. It does go through the integration test framework that I had mentioned, and then it can go to users from there. The CLI is actually the most annoying thing to release because it's something you locally install on your machine. So we don't have a forced deployment process that can go through Plural itself for people updating it. But we use a system called Go Releaser to stage new releases, and it will update a homebrew tab that will allow you to get a new version.
So yeah, that's non-trivial. There's a lot of moving pieces there. So yeah, I'm sure. And as you go further and further into this world, I'm sure you guys are going to automate away a bunch of those problems. Okay, so let's talk a little roadmap. What is on the roadmap?
Yeah. So there are a couple of big priorities for us. The biggest priority is around onboarding of users. So we think that the getting started experience is still not perfect, and we have some improvements in mind for that. One big thing that we've done, and it's actually been in development for a while, is you can actually use Plural in the browser. We have a Cloud Shell experience where you can provide some infrastructure credentials, the basic setup for a cluster, and it'll go straight into a shell, which is actually resolving to a Kubernetes pod with all the command line interfaces and everything installed appropriately, and create your first cluster just right in the browser. And we've done other things with that to make it easier for you to get started. So you can actually use a demo GCP project we'll create on the fly to create your first cluster in as well, just to test drive the experience and see if it's something that you actually want to commit to. And the other thing the big thing we're doing in the onboarding sphere is we're trying to create a fully interactive CLI experience where you can just sort of point and click for all the steps to start Plural. We're using the same framework that K9S uses, if you're familiar with that tool. That's a graphical Kubernetes dashboard on the command line, and hopefully we'll be able to have a really good kind of cool command line experience to configure your first applications and get everything working on Plural. You'll still have the same Git repository of all the artifacts, and the core experience is different. It's just a better layer on top for interacting with the various primitives.
Yeah, isn't that called a TUI? Don't we call that a TUI?
I actually don't know. A terminal UI? Yeah.
I think that's what I've been saying. I don't know. I don't know. Mark, what is that called? Do we know what that's called?
That was a new one to me, but that kind of makes sense. Terminal UI. So
I've been seeing TUI. I've seen TUI, and of course, me, I'm going to go with TUI on that one.
Well, I was going to say, so that's interesting to be able to build that terminal UI right into the CLI, because then, you mentioned, way back at the beginning here that Facebook would invest in these, building these web UIs. And now you have the tool, you have the UI, it's built right in order to avoid the context switching and be able to manage and handle the operational challenges of running that software.
Yeah. This usability challenge is actually very different too. The big issue is, while we give you a guided recipe for installing things, it's still it's really easy to input the wrong information. and the truth is, if you have something that's imitating a web form, a lot of people will interact with it a lot smoother. So that's kind of the intuition behind like investing in that sort of experience. We do have a graphical experience for installing applications in our console. It's just you can't go zero to console like without doing something. And we want to have the zero experience also be comparably good.
So let's talk a little bit more about the roadmap. Is that where you're focused right now, or are you focused on bringing new open source applications in? Where are you making the biggest investments as a company?
So the bringing in new open source applications is the other big focus. That's like in terms of like core platform work. That's our main focus. Our main focus is on onboarding experience. What we've done, we also have like a few DevOps people who are focused on onboarding new applications. We have two kind of strategies around where we're focusing on the things that we're onboarding. So the first one is we're focusing on the data stack. So a lot of these applications I've seen, like people definitely prefer to self-host them. You don't really love having Airflow running in separate infrastructure for security reasons. Same thing with Airbytes. Oftentimes you can't even connect to the databases that you'd want them to connect to, right? So like there's a very common self-hosting problem around them. They're really operationally annoying, and they're oftentimes kind of orphaned in terms of your core, like engineering process. So we think we can definitely help a lot with that. The other sort of like, I guess you could call it like pillar of applications that we're wanting to focus on is what I call like a Kubernetes Starter Kit. So if you think of like what you actually need to do to use Kubernetes, you never just need a control plane. You also need things like Argo CD. You need something for secret management, so Vault. You probably need some degree of VPN to get access to the internal network for debugging and other operational purposes. So what we want to do is, and then obviously you need like kind of the runtime layer stuff that's beyond Kubernetes, like external DNS, cert manager, some ingress controller, some solution for auto scaling, because it's very frequently not always a built-in feature for managed control planes. So what we want to do with Plural is use our deployment system to basically solve for that entire surrounding piece of the Kubernetes world for you, and then you can start using Kubernetes as you would hopefully be able to, like really, really easily.
That's cool. That's great. Like, so that I get, not just a best practice in configured Airflow in the example that we've been talking about here, but like everything about Kubernetes, like a GitOps and like good secret management and everything out of the box.
Yeah, exactly. And that would be more targeted for people who are using that Kubernetes cluster for first party development and not just for actually, orchestrating their open source infrastructure. So, you going back to like, the idea that Terraform can be baked in and it can actually create the Kubernetes cluster. Do you see patterns, best practices, any kind of trends around like, I have Kubernetes, but now I want Airflow. Should I deploy Airflow into my cluster, or should I bring a separate cluster along for it? Like one cluster, many clusters, like how do you think about that? The way we've done it, and I don't know necessarily like if it should be considered best practice or not, is we do like have many applications on one cluster. I feel like it depends on the specific application, because there are certain applications where this just totally breaks down. Kubeflow is the biggest example. So Kubeflow just is a very invasive product that does a lot of stuff, especially with Istio. And then it's also extremely resource intensive. And I feel like most people should have that just in a dedicated cluster. But you basically lose all the bin packing benefits if you don't pack multiple applications into the same cluster. So I can't imagine people wouldn't want to do that. And it's also more operationally complicated to have a lot of clusters lying around that you have to swap between as well. So and monitor and everything like that.
The last kind of topic that we often like to talk about when we think about open source projects is like community and engaging with the community. So the project, honestly, Plural, like I've seen it, it has quite a lot of depth to it, but like as Benjie mentioned earlier, it still doesn't have a lot of stars yet on GitHub. So I'm curious what you're doing today to engage with the community, both in like issues and, in roadmap and, like bug tracking and things like this, and or even code contributions in any plans that you have to change the way that you're engaging with the community.
Yeah, so the community stuff is like very much in its infancy, and the biggest first step we had is we actually just brought in our head of community. So that's going to be something that he's going to drive on a lot for us. The big things that we're doing currently, and I'm sure we'll end up creating a whole lot more initiatives around this, is we have biweekly demos that we advertise in our Discord channel for anyone who wants to track our updates. we obviously accept issues and pull requests as they come in. We have had a few people, for instance, like improve our Airflow deployment. We had a user at a company called FSN Capital who wanted to use Cloud SQL for the underlying database and modified the deployment to allow that to be a possibility. And then beyond that, what we'll start doing more is like things like content creation. We'll really spin up our blog and get more out there in terms of, like explaining why we're doing things and helping people, learn from our experience as well.
So wait, so you guys are members of Cloud Cncf and Linux Foundation, is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
So what does that look like? What does it mean being a member in this context?
So it's kind of amorphous. Like basically we're a sponsor. Our project is not a CNCF project itself or like a sandbox project at all. And that there's a good chance we won't go through that process for a number of reasons. But at the moment, what it means is we have basically given some sponsorship capital to the Linux Foundation, and we'll participate in in a variety of different events as a sponsor as well. So things like KubeCon and other Linux Foundation events. I can't remember all of them. There's a kind of a lot of them.
Yeah.
All right. So we have to ask, why not CNCF Sandbox? It's early, so I think it's unfair to commit either way. It's very early for you guys. But preliminarily, what are your thoughts on being a CNCF project?
I think for a lot of the projects that do it, it's an obvious no-brainer win for them because it's such a huge stamp of approval. There's a few things that are a consequence of it that we don't specifically like. The first big one is they take ownership of the brand of the product. And like in theory, that might not be the biggest deal. Like most of the companies around CNCF projects, like you can take as an example, Crossplane. They have a company around it as well, but it's not called Crossplane. It's very different. And this is the problem, right? So like you don't associate the company with the project as a result of the brand transfer. The other thing is, I don't know, it's not straightforward for me to figure out what decomposable piece of Plural is something that would be good in a CNCF as a CNCF project, because the system is pretty tightly coupled. Like the admin console really needs to have the CLI and the API. The API doesn't really make sense unless it has all the admin console and the CLI to interact with it.
Yeah.
And so like it maybe we could like factor out some portion of the CLI and make it a CNCF project, but it just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense independently. So that was the other big thing. We think of ourselves more as an open source project in like in the vein of something like GitLab, where it's a dual license open source project. We're gonna like be extremely transparent about the source code that we have, but it's not necessarily a standard CNCF model as a result of all those complexities.
I mean, that makes a whole lot of sense. I hate to admit it, but not every project should be a CNCF project, I guess, is what you're forcing out of me. But you're right.
Yeah,
true.
Yeah. A lot of the things that go into CNCF are like, I think they're kind of like cloud equivalents of, like the standard like GNU, like Unix tools in some ways, like there's like very like focused, specific tool for a specific job types of things. Like, etcd, really good, CP key value store. And that's all it is.
I'm sorry. It's etcd. Okay.
Yeah. etcd. Yeah. But like Plural is like such a kind of, it's a platform basically at the end of the day. And so it just doesn't fit in my mind.
No, look, people that are listening to us right now, they have things to understand, and it's really important to hear both sides of that story. So I think that's super interesting way to think about it. So we're recording this pretty early, right before KubeCon, but I know that there might be some stuff coming up when we release this, which is probably going to be towards the end of June. Do you have anything you want to tell us about, or anything we should keep an eye out for?
I think that's TBD. I think one of the things that we're definitely excited to show off when it's ready is we're redesigning like the entire user interface for app.plural SH, and it'll hopefully be a lot slicker and a lot more usable. So that's the one that's probably the biggest like real huge chunk of new product that we'll be releasing. And I think that that two-way experience as well will be really cool when that's also done. They're always like, I don't know, like they always kind of blow my mind. So
no, that's great. Well, look, Michael, we really appreciate having you on. Learned a lot here. I plan to go dig into a few things here, and really excited to see how you guys progress. Really appreciate you coming on. And I look forward to probably getting you back on here in a year or two and seeing what you've done.
Thanks for having me. We definitely appreciate having the opportunity to share about what we're doing here. So really, really do appreciate it.
Thanks, Michael. That's all we have time for today. If you're the maintainer of a Cncf project and would like to be a guest on this show, head over to Kubelist.com. To learn more about Heavybit, visit heavybit.com to check out the library. It's packed with amazing talks and content on sales, marketing, product, and more for founders of developer tools companies. And this podcast is brought to you by my company, Replicated, where we enable cloud-native software vendors to operationalize and scale the distribution of their modern on-prem software to their largest enterprise customers. Check us out at replicated.com.